A lavish wedding becomes the stage for an attempted humiliation that backfires spectacularly when medical results arrive. Within the gilded reception hall, champagne toasts turn to shocked whispers as test results circulate. Between vengeance and vindication lies a truth that will leave everyone questioning their assumptions. As celebration turns to revelation, the true meaning of family emerges. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The grand ballroom of the Blackwood Manor shimmered. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, honeyed light on the scene, illuminating the swirling silks and shimmering jewels of the wedding guests. Serafina, breathtaking in her ivory gown, felt the weight of the fabric, a stark contrast to the lightness she desperately tried to project. A forced smile played on her lips as she greeted guests, each carefully chosen word a shield against the turmoil within. Liam, her handsome groom, oblivious to her inner struggle, beamed beside her, his hand resting possessively on her lower back. The champagne flowed, a river of bubbly obliviousness washing over the carefully constructed facade of happiness. A faint tremor of anxiety ran through her as she caught Vivien's eye across the room. Her stepmother, a vision in emerald green, held a predatory grace, her smile a thin, dangerous line. The scent of lilies, Vivien's signature perfume, hung heavy in the air, a cloying sweetness that mirrored the woman herself. Serafina's stomach clenched. Tonight, the carefully laid plans of revenge brewed in Vivien's heart were about to come to fruition. "You look radiant, darling," Vivien purred, her voice laced with a honeyed venom that Serafina recognized instantly. She leaned in, her breath hot on Serafina's ear. But even the most beautiful flower can wilt under the harsh light of truth. The words were a poisoned dart, aimed directly at Serafina's carefully constructed composure. A knot tightened in Serafina's chest. The years of simmering resentment, the calculated humiliations, all culminated in this moment. Revenge pulsed through her veins, a hot, dangerous current threatening to overwhelm her. Yet, a tiny spark of hope flickered. Would Liam see through the charade? Would the truth prevail? The weight of those questions pressed down on her, as heavy as the tiara perched upon her head. The elegant ballroom, once a symbol of joy, now felt like a gilded cage, and she, its captive bird, was about to be exposed. The music swelled, a crescendo of violins and cellos that did little to soothe Serafina's churning stomach. The champagne flute felt cold and heavy in her hand, the bubbles a mocking echo of her inner turmoil. Liam, oblivious to her distress, leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against her skin. His words, meant to be comforting, felt like a cruel irony. "Thank you," she managed, her voice a mere breath. The smile she offered felt brittle, a fragile mask threatening to shatter. She glanced towards Vivien, who was engaged in animated conversation with a group of elegantly dressed women. Her laughter a brittle, high-pitched sound that grated on Serafina's nerves. The scent of lilies, cloying and suffocating, seemed to intensify, a constant reminder of the impending doom. Chloe, ever vigilant, squeezed Serafina's hand beneath the table. The silent gesture was a lifeline, a small comfort in the overwhelming tide of anxiety. Serafina returned the squeeze, her eyes meeting Chloe's across the table, finding a silent understanding in their shared apprehension. Richard, Liam's father, observed the scene from across the room, his expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality that concealed a keen awareness of the tension simmering beneath the surface of the celebration. His eyes flickered between Serafina and Vivien, a flicker of concern in their depths. Vivien's gaze locked onto Serafina's for a brief, charged moment. A subtle, almost imperceptible nod passed between her and the woman she'd been speaking with earlier. A lawyer, Serafina recalled, with a sharp, predatory gaze that mirrored her stepmother's own. The unspoken message sent a chill down Serafina's spine, solidifying the dread that had been gnawing at her all evening. The carefully constructed facade of happiness crumbled further, replaced by a grim determination. Tonight, the fight was on. Tonight, the truth would be revealed, even if she had to reveal it herself. The weight of the tiara felt crushing. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a battleground, and she was ready to fight. The clinking of champagne flutes was a discordant symphony against the throbbing in Serafina's temples. Each celebratory chime felt like a hammer blow against the fragile composure she'd painstakingly constructed. The opulent ballroom, a shimmering cage of crystal chandeliers and polished mahogany, felt suffocating. The scent of lilies, once intoxicating, now clung to her like a shroud. Liam, oblivious to her turmoil, smiled, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. "You're breathtaking," he murmured, his voice a comforting balm against the storm raging within her. But the words felt hollow, a stark contrast to the icy dread creeping into her heart. Chloe, sensing her friend's distress, leaned in, her whisper barely audible above the murmur of conversation. "He's coming," she said, her voice tight with apprehension. "The lawyer." Serafina nodded, her throat constricting. The lawyer, Vivien's pawn, was the harbinger of her stepmother's carefully planned humiliation. A manufactured scandal, designed to shatter her reputation and destroy her happiness. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. Vivien, radiating false warmth, moved through the crowd like a predator. Her smile, flawless and chillingly serene, didn't reach her eyes that held a predatory glint that Serafina knew all too well. The woman she'd been speaking to earlier, the lawyer, slipped discreetly away, her sharp features etched with an almost gleeful anticipation. Richard, Liam's father, watched them, his brow furrowed in silent contemplation. His gaze, sharp and assessing, lingered on Vivien, then shifted to Serafina, a mixture of concern and something akin to pity etched on his face. He understood the game, Serafina knew. He had always known. The air thickened with a palpable sense of foreboding. The music, once celebratory, now felt ominous, a prelude to something terrible. Serafina felt a cold hand clutch at her heart, a stark reminder of the vulnerability beneath her carefully constructed facade. The battle, she knew, was about to begin, and this time she wasn't sure she could win. The weight of the tiara, once a symbol of joy, now felt like a lead weight, threatening to drag her under. The champagne tasted like ashes in her mouth. The lawyer, a thin woman with sharp, predatory eyes, approached Serafina, a cruel smile playing on her lips. The scent of lilies, heavy in the air, suddenly felt cloying, a suffocating sweetness mirroring the nausea rising in Serafina's throat. Liam, oblivious, squeezed her hand, his touch strangely cold despite his warm smile. "Everything all right, darling?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmuring guests. Serafina managed a weak smile, a ghost of her usual radiant self. "Perfect," she lied, the word tasting like ash on her tongue. Chloe, sensing the deception, subtly shifted closer, her hand resting reassuringly on Serafina's arm. The pressure was a silent reassurance, a small comfort in the growing storm. Vivien, her stepmother, watched from across the room, a predatory gleam in her eyes. Her smile was a carefully constructed mask, hiding the simmering malice Serafina knew so well. The champagne flutes, once symbols of celebration, now seemed like weapons poised to strike. The clinking glass felt like a relentless, mocking rhythm. "I have some documents," the lawyer announced, her voice cutting through the polite chatter. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. A hush fell over the room, the music fading to a muted background hum. All eyes turned to Serafina, a sudden, palpable shift in the atmosphere. The warmth of the ballroom vanished, replaced by a chilling silence, broken only by the rapid beat of Serafina's heart. Liam's hand tightened on hers, his brow furrowing with concern. He sensed something was wrong, a disquiet that echoed the unease rippling through the room. His earlier carefree demeanor was gone, replaced by a growing apprehension mirrored in the worried glances exchanged between Richard and Chloe. The lawyer produced a slim folder, its crisp white surface stark against the opulent surroundings. Serafina felt a cold dread grip her, a certainty that this was the moment Vivien had been meticulously orchestrating. This was the culmination of years of simmering resentment, a calculated act of revenge disguised as a simple revelation. The lawyer began to read, her voice measured and emotionless. Each carefully chosen word was a dagger, piercing Serafina's carefully constructed composure. The fabricated scandal, detailed with chilling precision, painted a devastating picture, twisting truth into a grotesque caricature. Tears stung Serafina's eyes, blurring the faces of the shocked onlookers. The shimmering ballroom seemed to spin, the opulent decor transforming into a suffocating prison. The weight of the tiara, once a symbol of joy, pressed down, a suffocating burden. Her breath hitched in her throat. This was it, the moment of utter humiliation. Or so Vivien believed. The lawyer's voice, crisp and devoid of emotion, sliced through the suffocating silence. Each word, a carefully chosen weapon, landed with the force of a physical blow. Serafina's carefully constructed composure fractured, replaced by a chilling dread. The opulent ballroom, once a haven of shimmering joy, transformed into a suffocating cage. The scent of lilies, previously intoxicating, now felt cloying, mirroring the nausea churning in her stomach. Liam's hand, initially a source of comfort, now felt strangely cold, his grip tightening with a growing apprehension that mirrored her own. Chloe, her eyes blazing with protective fury, leaned closer, her silent support a lifeline in the churning sea of betrayal. Richard, his face etched with a mixture of concern and barely concealed anger, exchanged a fleeting glance with his wife, Vivien. Her smile, once a carefully crafted mask of charm, faltered, revealing a flicker of something akin to fear beneath the surface. The documents, the lawyer continued, her voice measured and unwavering, indicate a discrepancy in Miss Serafina's past. The unspoken accusations hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Whispers rippled through the crowd, a venomous tide threatening to engulf Serafina. She felt Liam's body tense beside her, his earlier obliviousness replaced by a dawning comprehension of the unfolding disaster. A discrepancy? Richard's voice, low and resonant, cut through the murmurs. His eyes, sharp and assessing, were fixed on Vivien. The unspoken accusation in his tone was sharper than any spoken word. The subtle shift in his gaze, the barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, spoke volumes about his shifting allegiance. The carefully constructed facade of family unity began to crumble, revealing the deep fissures that ran beneath the surface. Vivien's smile tightened, her eyes darting nervously towards the lawyer, then back to Richard. Her composure, always so flawlessly maintained, was beginning to crack. The mask of charm was slipping, revealing a vulnerability Serafina had never before witnessed. The revelation, whatever its nature, was clearly striking at the very heart of Vivien's carefully cultivated image. The champagne flutes, once symbols of celebration, now seemed like menacing weapons in a silent, simmering battle. The clinking of glass echoed in Serafina's ears, a mocking rhythm accompanying the growing dread in her heart. The lawyer paused, allowing the devastating impact of her words to sink in. The air crackled with anticipation, the silence pregnant with unspoken accusations and simmering resentments. The meticulously planned humiliation was underway, but the carefully laid plans were about to be dramatically disrupted. The lawyer's paws stretched, a taut rubber band threatening to snap. Serafina felt the weight of the unspoken accusations pressing down, the opulent ballroom suddenly feeling claustrophobic. The scent of lilies, once sweet, now clung to her like a shroud. Liam's hand, cold and clammy, gripped hers, his usual easy smile replaced by a mask of bewilderment. Chloe's hand squeezed hers, a silent promise of unwavering support. The discrepancy, the lawyer finally announced, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, concerns a prior engagement on Miss Serafina's part. A collective gasp swept through the room. Whispers, like venomous snakes, slithered through the assembled guests. Vivien's carefully crafted smile didn't waver, but a subtle tremor ran through her perfectly manicured hand. Richard's gaze, sharp and unwavering, locked onto Vivien, a silent storm brewing in his eyes. A prior engagement? Liam's voice, barely a whisper, trembled. His eyes, usually sparkling with affection, were filled with hurt and confusion. He looked from Serafina to Vivien, his trust shattered. An engagement that, according to these documents, the lawyer continued, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, was never dissolved. Serafina felt a wave of nausea. This was it. Vivien's carefully laid trap had sprung. But even as panic threatened to consume her, a flicker of defiance ignited within. This wasn't just about her reputation. It was about the truth. This is a lie. Chloe's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the whispers. She stood, her eyes blazing with fury, confronting Vivien directly. You're trying to ruin her. Vivien's composure finally cracked. The mask of serenity slipped, revealing the cold fury simmering beneath. Chloe, darling, you misunderstand, she purred, her voice laced with false sweetness. These documents speak for themselves. Richard stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. Enough, he said, his voice low but firm, silencing the room. He looked at Vivien, his gaze piercing. Vivien, explain yourself. The carefully constructed facade of the perfect family crumbled, replaced by raw emotion and unspoken resentments. The champagne flutes, once symbols of celebration, felt like fragile reminders of a shattered dream. The weight of the unspoken hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. As the drama unfolded, poised on the precipice of a devastating truth, the hushed whispers, like a swarm of agitated bees, buzzed around Serafina. The scent of lilies, heavy and cloying, seemed to suffocate her. Liam's hand, cold and trembling, felt alien in hers. His eyes, usually bright with laughter, were clouded with a confusion that mirrored her own rising panic. Vivien, however, remained composed, a predator watching its prey trapped. Her smile, a cruel parody of grace, didn't waver. A prior engagement? Liam repeated, his voice barely audible above the buzzing whispers. His gaze darted between Serafina and Vivien, his trust visibly fracturing. The opulent ballroom, moments ago a symbol of joyous celebration, now felt like a gilded cage, its walls closing in. Chloe, her face a mask of fury, stepped forward. This is a lie, she declared, her voice ringing with indignation. You're trying to ruin her. Her eyes, blazing with righteous anger, locked onto Vivien, daring her to deny it. Vivien's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. A tremor ran through her, a fleeting glimpse of the vulnerability she so diligently concealed. Chloe, darling, she purred, her voice laced with a false sweetness that grated on Serafina's nerves. You misunderstand. These documents speak for themselves. Richard, his face grim, stepped into the fray. His gaze, sharp and unwavering, met Vivien's. The years of unspoken resentment, of compromises made and betrayals suffered, seemed to flash between them. Vivien, he said, his voice low and firm, the authority in his tones silencing the murmuring crowd. Explain yourself. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, with the weight of secrets finally poised to spill into the open. The champagne flutes, sparkling moments before, now seemed like fragile symbols of a dream shattered. The opulent setting, once a beacon of happiness, was now a stage for a drama far more devastating than anyone could have predicted. Serafina, caught in the eye of the storm, felt a chilling premonition the truth, whatever it was, would irrevocably alter everything. The carefully constructed facade of the perfect family was crumbling, revealing the raw, unvarnished reality beneath. The air hung heavy with unspoken accusations, the scent of lilies battling with the metallic tang of fear. Serafina felt Liam's hand tremble in hers, the warmth gone, replaced by a chilling coldness that mirrored the dread creeping into her heart. Vivien, however, remained a statue of composure, her smile a cruel, glittering mask. Richard, his face etched with a grim determination, stepped forward, his presence silencing the murmuring crowd. "Vivien," he began, his voice a low rumble that carried across the room. "I believe an explanation is in order." Vivien's carefully crafted composure finally faltered. A flicker of something, fear, regret, crossed her face before she regained her composure, a practiced performance. "Richard, darling," she purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. These documents clearly. Documents that conveniently appeared at the most opportune moment." Chloe interrupted, her voice ringing with righteous anger, her eyes, blazing with fury, locked onto Vivien. "This is about control, isn't it? About humiliating Serafina because she threatens your power." The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A pin could have been heard dropping in the stunned silence that followed. Serafina, caught in the crossfire, felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The opulent ballroom, once a haven of joyous celebration, now felt like a suffocating tomb. The glittering chandeliers seemed to mock her with their cold, unfeeling light. Liam, his face pale and drawn, looked from Serafina to Vivien, his eyes filled with a confusion that bordered on despair. The carefully constructed image of his future wife's family was shattering before his eyes, revealing a fractured reality far more complex than he ever imagined. He squeezed Serafina's hand, a silent plea for understanding, a desperate attempt to anchor himself amidst the chaos. The tension crackled, palpable and raw. The whispered conversations of the guests ceased, replaced by a collective intake of breath. Even the music, a lilting waltz moments before, seemed to falter, mirroring the crumbling foundation of the family's carefully constructed facade. The truth, whatever it was about to be unveiled. And Serafina knew with a chilling certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of the impending revelation pressed down on her, heavy and inescapable, a suffocating blanket of anxiety woven from betrayal and uncertainty. The wedding ceremony concluded with a shower of rose petals, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Serafina's heart. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and champagne, held a suffocating tension. Vivien, radiating false warmth, offered a seemingly innocuous hug, her touch icy despite the outward display of affection. "My dear Serafina," she whispered, her voice a silken caress that masked a viper's strike. "You look absolutely radiant." The words felt like a poisoned dart, aimed straight at Serafina's carefully constructed composure. Liam, oblivious to the undercurrents, beamed, his eyes shining with love. He squeezed Serafina's hand, a gesture meant to reassure, but it only amplified her unease. Later, during the reception, amidst the clinking of glasses and the murmur of polite conversation, Vivien engaged Richard in a hushed discussion, their faces close, their voices conspiratorial whispers lost in the celebratory din, yet visible enough to fuel Serafina's growing dread. A nervous flutter took hold in her stomach, a physical manifestation of her fear. The champagne tasted metallic, the music jarring against the anxiety building inside her. Chloe, ever vigilant, noticed Serafina's distress. Leaning in, she whispered, "He's there, by the fountain." Serafina followed Chloe's gaze to a man standing subtly near the water feature, his features obscured by shadow. The man appeared to be awaiting a signal, his presence a chilling confirmation of Vivien's plan. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Serafina's carefully constructed facade. The opulent ballroom, previously a symbol of joy, transformed into a gilded cage, trapping her in a web of deceit and impending humiliation. The weight of her secret and Vivien's vengeful plot pressed down on her, heavier than any crown. The celebratory atmosphere felt suffocating, the laughter of the guests a cruel mockery of her inner turmoil. The champagne flute felt heavy in Serafina's hand, the effervescence mirroring the turmoil within her. The gilded ballroom shimmered, a kaleidoscope of light and laughter, but to Serafina, it felt like a prison. Across the room, Vivien's laughter, brittle and sharp, sliced through the festive music. It was a sound Serafina had come to recognize, the sound of calculated cruelty. Chloe squeezed Serafina's hand, a silent reassurance. "He's still there," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible above the music. Serafina's gaze drifted back to the man by the fountain, a shadow lurking in the periphery of the celebration. He was the accomplice, the instrument of Vivien's revenge. A wave of nausea washed over Serafina. The carefully constructed facade she'd maintained throughout the ceremony crumbled. The weight of Vivien's impending humiliation pressed down on her, a suffocating weight threatening to drown her in despair. Liam, oblivious to the darkness gathering, leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You're beautiful," he murmured, his voice thick with adoration. The words, meant to comfort, felt like a cruel irony. Serafina managed a weak smile, the effort painful. She couldn't bear to burden him with her fear, her dread. Not yet. The music swelled, a crescendo of strings and brass, drowning out the whispered anxieties. Vivien, her smile a predatory mask, raised her glass. The clinking of glasses announced the beginning of her act. Serafina felt a cold dread creeping up her spine, a primal instinct warning her of impending danger. The air thickened, charged with anticipation, the joyous atmosphere replaced by a palpable tension. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat accompanying the approaching storm. The sweet taste of champagne turned bitter on her tongue, a potent symbol of the poisoned chalice Vivien had prepared. This was it, the moment of truth, the culmination of years of simmering resentment and carefully plotted revenge. And Serafina, trapped in her gilded cage, braced herself for the impact. The clinking of glasses escalated, a wave of sound crashing against Serafina. Vivien, a predator poised to strike, raised her glass, her smile a cruel parody of warmth. The spotlight, previously focused on the happy couple, subtly shifted, illuminating Vivien like a spotlight on a stage. The air crackled with anticipation, the scent of lilies and champagne suddenly sharp, almost suffocating. Serafina felt Liam's hand tighten on hers, his touch a grounding force in the maelstrom brewing around them. To Serafina and Liam, Vivien's voice, amplified by the microphone, cut through the room, laced with a honeyed sweetness that felt sickeningly false. May their life together be blessed with unexpected revelations. The final words hung in the air, heavy with implication. A hush fell over the room, the celebratory chatter replaced by a nervous silence. Chloe, her eyes wide with apprehension, squeezed Serafina's hand again, her silent plea a stark counterpoint to the forced gaiety around them. Richard, Liam's father, his face a mask of controlled anxiety, subtly shifted his position, his gaze flicking between Vivien and Serafina, his shrewd eyes assessing the unfolding drama. From the corner of her eye, Serafina saw the man from the fountain, his face obscured by shadow, yet his presence palpable, a chilling reminder of Vivien's calculated cruelty. He held a small, sealed envelope, its crisp white surface gleaming under the dim lights. The approach of this mysterious figure created an undeniable undercurrent of foreboding. The happiness of the wedding vanished, swallowed by the creeping dread. Liam, oblivious to the impending storm, leaned closer, his whispered words meant to comfort, instead sounding hollow and out of place. "Everything's going to be all right," he murmured, his voice laced with an unconvincing confidence. Serafina managed a weak smile, the effort a physical strain. She couldn't betray him with her fear, not yet. The moment hung suspended, a tense precipice before the inevitable plunge. The envelope approached, a symbol of pending doom, a harbinger of the carefully orchestrated humiliation. The sweet taste of champagne turned bitter on her tongue. The once celebratory atmosphere now tasted like ash. The man approached, his gait deliberate, the envelope clutched in his hand like a weapon. The gilded hall, moments before vibrant with laughter, now hummed with a suffocating silence. Crystal chandeliers cast long, dancing shadows, distorting the faces of the guests, their expressions shifting from polite smiles to apprehensive frowns. The scent of lilies, once intoxicating, now felt cloying, heavy in the air. Vivien's smile faltered, a hairline crack in her flawless facade. Her eyes, usually bright and calculating, held a flicker of something akin to fear. Serafina couldn't be sure. The man reached Vivien, his movements almost imperceptible. A silent exchange passing between them, a brief, chilling glance, a barely perceptible nod. "Forgive the interruption," the man announced, his voice surprisingly calm, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Serafina's gut. He handed the envelope to Vivien, his fingers brushing hers, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down Serafina's spine. Vivien's hand trembled as she took the envelope. The creamy paper, crisp and unforgiving, seemed to reflect the turmoil within her. For a fleeting moment, her composure wavered, and Serafina saw a vulnerability she'd never anticipated. "Darling," Vivien said, her voice betraying a tremor she desperately tried to mask. "There's been a slight delay with the arrangements." Her eyes, briefly meeting Serafina's, held a hint of something akin to regret. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by her usual mask of composure. Liam, oblivious, squeezed Serafina's hand again. "What's wrong?" he whispered, his voice laced with concern. "Nothing, darling," Serafina replied, her voice barely a breath. She could feel Chloe's hand gripping hers, a silent message of support. Richard, observing from a distance, his expression unreadable, subtly signaled to someone out of Serafina's line of sight. The tension was palpable, a living thing that coiled in the air, tightening its grip with every passing second. The champagne flutes felt heavy in their hands, the bubbles within no longer a symbol of celebration, but of the unspoken anxieties bubbling beneath the surface. The music, once lively and upbeat, had faded to a subdued hum, amplifying the oppressive silence. The envelope remained untouched, a symbol of the impending storm, its pristine whiteness a stark contrast to the darkening storm clouds gathering on the horizon of Serafina's future. The gilded cage, once a symbol of happiness, now felt like a prison, its opulent walls closing in. The champagne flowed, a golden river against the backdrop of shimmering white linens. But the celebratory air felt thin, brittle, like spun glass. Serafina, her smile a carefully constructed mask, felt the weight of Vivien's gaze, a palpable pressure that settled on her like a shroud. The music swelled, a vibrant counterpoint to the icy dread that coiled in her stomach. Liam, oblivious to the tempest brewing, leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice a balm against the icy fear. His touch, a gentle pressure on her hand, was a lifeline in the swirling chaos. She forced a smile, a fragile thing, easily shattered. Across the room, Vivien's laughter, bright and sharp as shattered crystal, cut through the music. She moved with a predatory grace, a queen surveying her kingdom, her eyes glittering with something cold and calculating. Serafina caught a glimpse of a whispered conversation between Vivien and a sharply dressed man. Their faces close, their voices hushed. The man's hand, swift and discreet, slipped something into Vivien's clutch. A shiver, unrelated to the cool evening air, ran down Serafina's spine. Chloe, sensing the shift in Serafina's demeanor, squeezed her hand. "It's going to be all right," she murmured, her voice a quiet strength against the rising tide of anxiety. Serafina offered a weak smile, the effort painful. Doubt, a venomous serpent, slithered into her heart. Had she underestimated Vivien's capacity for cruelty? The meticulously planned moment arrived, marked only by a subtle shift in the room's energy. The music softened, the laughter dimmed. Vivien, her smile radiating false sweetness, raised her glass. "To Serafina," she announced, her voice honeyed yet sharp. "May your happiness be as boundless as the ocean." The words hung heavy, laced with a subtle undercurrent of something else entirely, something sharp and bitter. The carefully chosen moment was here. The reveal was about to begin. Serafina felt a knot of dread tighten in her chest, a physical manifestation of her burgeoning fear. The gilded cage, once a symbol of joy, now felt like a trap, closing in. The weight of expectation hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. She braced herself, the carefully constructed facade threatening to crumble. The clinking of champagne flutes momentarily ceased as Vivien, a vision in emerald silk, raised her glass. The scent of lilies and expensive perfume hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the icy dread clawing at Serafina's insides. Liam, completely unaware, squeezed Serafina's hand, his smile radiant. "To my beautiful bride," he announced, his voice booming over the hushed whispers. Vivien's smile was a masterpiece of deception, a flawless mask hiding the storm brewing within. "Indeed," she purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "To a union as radiant as this celebration." Her gaze, however, flickered briefly towards the sharply dressed man, a subtle signal, almost imperceptible to anyone but Serafina. The man nodded, almost imperceptibly, a silent acknowledgement of the impending drama. The music swelled again, a waltz that spun the guests into a dizzying whirl of laughter and conversation. But for Serafina, the world narrowed, focusing solely on Vivien's calculated movements. Each graceful step, each perfectly placed gesture, felt like a tightening of the noose. The gilded cage, once a symbol of joy, felt like a suffocating prison. Chloe, ever vigilant, noticed the shift in Serafina's demeanor. She leaned close, her voice a low murmur against the music. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her hand resting reassuringly on Serafina's arm. Serafina forced a smile, the effort painful. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice barely a whisper. The truth, a bitter pill, coated her tongue. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced her carefully constructed composure. This was it. The moment Vivien had been meticulously crafting for weeks, months even. The carefully orchestrated humiliation was about to begin. The weight of it pressed down on her, a crushing burden. She could almost taste the bitter sting of public shame. Richard, Liam's father, observed from across the room. He saw the subtle exchange between Vivien and the man, the almost imperceptible nod, the barely there tightening of Vivien's lips. A knot of unease formed in his stomach, a premonition of impending trouble. His gaze shifted to Serafina, his heart aching for his son's unsuspecting happiness. He sensed a storm gathering, a darkness lurking beneath the surface of this opulent celebration. The champagne tasted like ash in his mouth. This wasn't the joyous occasion he'd envisioned. He felt the cold weight of unspoken truths hanging heavy in the air, the chilling anticipation of a revelation that would shatter the illusion of perfection. The waltz spun Serafina away from Chloe, the music a dizzying counterpoint to the icy dread gripping her heart. Each swirling step felt like a betrayal, a surrender to Vivien's carefully laid trap. The scent of lilies, usually so comforting, now felt suffocating, a cloying sweetness masking the bitter taste of impending humiliation. She caught Liam's gaze, his adoration a painful irony against the impending storm. His smile, once so bright, now seemed fragile, easily shattered. "Liam," she mouthed, the word lost in the music's crescendo. He leaned closer, his brow furrowed in concern. "Are you all right, darling?" he whispered, his voice laced with worry. Serafina managed a weak smile, her throat tight with unshed tears. "Perfectly fine," she whispered back, her voice trembling slightly. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Across the room, Vivien observed, her emerald gown shimmering like a predator's scales. The man she'd signaled earlier approached, a document discreetly exchanged between them, a subtle transaction veiled by the swirling dancers. The carefully crafted evidence was in place. Her triumphant smile was a chilling thing, devoid of warmth. The moment of her revenge was at hand. Richard, his gaze fixed on the subtle exchange, felt a cold dread settle in his gut. His son's happiness hung precariously in the balance. This wasn't just a family squabble anymore. This was a deliberate act of cruelty, carefully planned and executed. He saw the subtle shift in Serafina's demeanor, the way her shoulders slumped, the way her eyes, once sparkling with joy, were now clouded with fear. The music softened, transitioning into a slower, more intimate melody. Vivien, her moment perfectly timed, began to subtly steer the conversation towards Serafina. Her voice, usually so pleasant, held a sharp edge, a venomous sweetness. She started weaving a tale, delicately dropping hints, sowing seeds of doubt in the minds of the guests. A few heads turned, conversations hushed, attention shifting toward the bride. The whispers started, like a low hum, building into a menacing crescendo. Serafina felt the net tightening, the trap closing. Chloe, her eyes narrowed, saw the calculated maneuver, the way Vivien subtly poisoned the well of goodwill. She gripped Serafina's arm tighter, a silent gesture of support in the face of the impending storm. Rage warred with her need for discretion, a precarious balance hanging on the edge of a knife. She knew she needed to act, but how? The clock was ticking, and Serafina was the target. The once joyous celebration was rapidly transforming into a battlefield, the stakes as high as a family's shattered reputation. The opulent ballroom now felt like a suffocating pressure cooker, ready to explode. The champagne flutes, once brimming with celebratory bubbles, now felt heavy in Serafina's trembling hand. The crystal clinked against the fine china, a discordant sound against the forced gaiety swirling around her. Vivien's voice, a silken whisper laced with venom, slithered through the room, weaving a narrative of betrayal and deceit. Serafina's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The opulent ballroom, once a shimmering haven of joy, now felt like a suffocating cage. The lilies, once fragrant, now smelled cloying, their sweetness a cruel mockery of her misery. Liam, oblivious to the subtle poison seeping into the atmosphere, squeezed her hand. "You're pale, darling," he murmured, his concern genuine, his eyes full of love. Serafina forced a smile, the muscles in her face aching with the effort. "Just a little overwhelmed," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the guests. The lie tasted like ash, bitter and sharp on her tongue. Chloe, her eyes blazing with righteous fury, edged closer, her hand resting protectively on Serafina's arm. The unspoken message of solidarity was a balm to Serafina's wounded spirit. She saw the exchange between Vivien and the man, the furtive glance, the discreet passing of the document. A damning piece of fabricated evidence designed to destroy Serafina's reputation, a carefully laid trap. Richard watched, his usually jovial face etched with worry. He'd seen the insidious undercurrent of Vivien's actions, the calculated cruelty masked by a veneer of charm. He knew he had to intervene, to protect his son's happiness, but the weight of years of unspoken resentments and carefully constructed compromises held him back. His gaze shifted to Serafina, her eyes mirroring his own turmoil, reflecting the storm brewing around them. The festive atmosphere felt thin, a fragile veil barely concealing the bitter truth about to be unleashed. The music swelled, a poignant counterpoint to the escalating tension, highlighting the fragility of happiness hanging by a thread. The whispered accusations, once a subtle hum, were growing louder, more menacing, threatening to engulf Serafina. The gilded cage had become a trap. The document, a pristine white sheet crisply folded, landed on the table like a poisoned dart. Vivien's smile, usually a captivating mask, was a brittle thing, strained around the edges. "My dear Serafina," she purred, her voice a silken blade, "I believe this might clarify a few things." The hushed whispers of the guests intensified, a rising tide of speculation. Liam, his face etched with confusion, looked from the document to Serafina, his eyes wide with a dawning unease. Serafina's breath hitched, the carefully constructed facade of happiness shattered, leaving raw vulnerability exposed. The champagne glass in her hand trembled, its contents sloshing precariously. "What is it?" Liam's voice, usually a comforting baritone, held a tremor of fear. Vivien, her eyes glittering with a cruel triumph, unfolded the paper. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket stifling the vibrant energy of moments before. The words, stark and accusing, were projected onto a large screen, visible to every guest. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. Serafina's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence. Chloe's gasp cut through the stunned silence. She stood, her face flushed with anger, protectively placing a hand on Serafina's arm. "This is a lie," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction, challenging Vivien's carefully cultivated composure. "This is utter fabrication." Richard's gaze darted between his wife and Serafina, his face a mask of controlled fury. He saw the pain etched on his son's face, the confusion that mirrored his own. The weight of his silence pressed down on him, a burden of unspoken resentments and years of carefully constructed compromises. He knew deep down that Vivien had gone too far. The elegant ballroom, once a symbol of lavish celebration, had transformed into a battlefield of shattered illusions and exposed truths. The scent of lilies, once sweet and delicate, now hung heavy and cloying in the air, a suffocating sweetness mirroring the suffocating tension. The crystal chandeliers shimmered, their light casting long, sharp shadows that emphasized the stark reality of the situation. The music, once a joyous celebration, now felt like a mocking soundtrack to Serafina's despair. The gilded cage had indeed sprung its trap. The words on the screen, stark and unforgiving, hung in the air like a death sentence. Serafina felt Liam's hand, cold and trembling, clasp hers. The champagne, once a symbol of celebration, now tasted like ash in her mouth. The crystal chandeliers, previously sparkling with joyous light, seemed to mock her with their cold, glittering indifference. Chloe's voice, sharp and defiant, cut through the stunned silence. "This is a lie," she repeated, her eyes blazing with righteous fury, her gaze locked onto Vivien. Vivien's carefully constructed composure cracked, a flicker of something akin to fear momentarily replacing the cruel triumph in her eyes. Richard, his face a mask of controlled rage, moved towards Vivien. The unspoken weight of years of carefully maintained peace hung heavy between them. His silence, usually a shield, now felt like a betrayal, a complicity in his wife's cruelty. He opened his mouth, then closed it, the words caught in his throat. The unspoken question hung in the air. How could he have been so blind? A hush fell over the room, broken only by the faint clinking of forgotten champagne flutes. Then, a sudden commotion near the entrance. A nurse, her face etched with concern, pushed her way through the stunned guests, carrying a slim manila envelope. She approached Richard, her eyes darting to Vivien. "Mr. Harding," she said, her voice low and urgent. "These arrived just now. Urgent results." Richard took the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly. He tore it open, his eyes scanning the contents. A sharp intake of breath escaped his lips. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the room, settling on Vivien. Her carefully painted smile faltered, replaced by a look of utter terror. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable, punctuated only by Vivien's ragged breathing. Then, Richard's voice, low and gravelly, filled the room. "Vivien," he said, his voice heavy with a mixture of grief and accusation. "There are things you haven't told us." He held up the medical report, the words stark and undeniable. The implications were clear, horrifyingly so. Vivien's carefully constructed world, her elaborate web of deceit, began to unravel thread by thread. The gilded cage, it seemed, had sprung its trap on her, not Serafina. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Crystal chandeliers cast long, accusing shadows across the faces of the stunned guests. Serafina felt Liam's hand tighten in hers, a lifeline in the storm of accusations. His eyes, usually bright with mirth, were clouded with confusion and hurt. The champagne flutes, once clinking merrily, now sat abandoned, their contents untouched, mirroring the frozen tableau before her. Vivien, her face a mask of barely controlled fury, glared at Chloe. "You insolent girl," she hissed, her voice a brittle whisper that somehow managed to cut through the stunned silence. "You dare to accuse me?" Chloe, her chin held high, met Vivien's gaze unflinchingly. "I dare to defend my friend," she retorted, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. "And the truth will come out, Vivien. Always does." The air crackled with unspoken accusations, the tension palpable, heavy as a velvet curtain. Richard, his face etched with a turmoil Serafina had never witnessed, stood frozen between them. The medical report, still clutched in his hand, felt like a verdict, heavy and unforgiving. He glanced at Vivien, his eyes filled with a profound sadness, a mixture of grief and betrayal that mirrored the storm raging within Serafina herself. The arrival of the nurse and the medical results had shifted the tectonic plates of the reception. The carefully constructed facade of perfection, of happiness, had crumbled, revealing the raw, ugly truth beneath. Serafina felt a wave of nausea, the opulent ballroom suddenly suffocating, the scent of lilies and champagne now cloying and acrid. She looked at Liam, his face etched with a profound sadness, and saw the question hanging unspoken in his eyes. Could he trust her? Could he trust anyone? The weight of his uncertainty was almost heavier than the accusation against her. Her own fear was a bitter taste on her tongue, a cold dread that clung to her like a shroud. But underneath that fear, a spark of defiance ignited, fueled by the unfairness of it all, by the cruel injustice of Vivien's actions. The truth, she realized, was more than a matter of exoneration. It was about survival, about reclaiming her life from the clutches of her stepmother's venomous machinations. The fight, she realized, had just begun. The silence hung heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from disbelief and whispered accusations. Crystal chandeliers glittered, their light reflecting off the shocked, pale faces of the guests. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and spilled champagne, now carried a bitter tang of betrayal. Liam's hand, gripping Serafina's, was icy, his touch conveying a fear that mirrored her own. His usually warm brown eyes were clouded with confusion and a deep, wounding hurt. "Liam," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible above the stunned hush. The words caught in her throat, choked by a rising tide of panic. She wanted to explain, to scream the truth, but the words seemed to evaporate before they reached her lips. Vivien, her carefully constructed composure shattered, stood rigid, her face a mask of furious disbelief. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't disguise the tremor in her jaw, the stark white of her knuckles clenched around a crumpled napkin. The elegant silk of her gown seemed to mock her inner turmoil, its sheen highlighting the furious gleam in her eyes. "This is a lie!" she shrieked, her voice brittle and laced with desperation. "A fabrication!" Chloe, small but resolute, stood her ground. Her gaze, steady and unwavering, met Vivien's. "The report speaks for itself," Chloe said, her voice ringing with a quiet strength that belied her trembling hands. The medical report, finally released from Richard's grasp, lay on a nearby table, a stark white document amidst the scattered debris of shattered illusions. Richard, his face etched with an agony that surpassed even Serafina's own, stood frozen, caught between his wife and the shattering truth. The weight of years of unspoken resentments, of compromises made and betrayals concealed, pressed down on him, a crushing burden. He looked at Vivien, his eyes filled with a sorrow so profound it stole the breath from the onlookers. It was a look that spoke volumes, a look that revealed a lifetime of silent suffering. Serafina felt a cold dread, a stark awareness that this wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about exposing a truth far more devastating, a truth that would shatter not only Vivien's carefully constructed facade, but their family's fragile equilibrium. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of extravagant celebration, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping them all in a suffocating web of lies and long-hidden secrets. The fight, she knew, was far from over. It was just beginning. Chloe, her voice tight with controlled fury, stepped forward. The scent of lilies, usually so sweet, now felt cloying, suffocating in the tense silence. "Vivien," she said, her gaze unwavering, "this is despicable. You knew this report would arrive. You deliberately orchestrated this humiliation. Vivien, her face a mask of crumbling composure, sputtered, "It's not what it seems. A misunderstanding." Her voice cracked, the carefully constructed facade of elegant composure crumbling like cheap plaster. The champagne flutes, abandoned halfway to lips, reflected the flickering candlelight, their elegant forms mocking the chaos that had erupted. Liam, his face pale and drawn, looked from Serafina to Vivien, his eyes filled with a confusion so profound it hurt to witness. He reached for Serafina's hand, his touch tentative, as if afraid to break something fragile. Serafina, numb with a mixture of relief and disbelief, squeezed his hand tightly. The weight of the accusation, the public shame, was finally lifted, but a new, heavier weight settled in its place. The crushing revelation of Vivien's deceit. Richard, his shoulders slumped with weariness, watched the scene unfold. The glittering ballroom, once a symbol of joy, now seemed to amplify the raw emotions swirling in the air. The silence, broken only by Vivien's gasps and Chloe's measured pronouncements, felt heavy, oppressive, like a physical force pressing down on them all. He saw the hurt in Liam's eyes, the quiet strength in Chloe's, and the raw, wounded vulnerability in Serafina's. He felt a profound sense of failure, a crushing realization of how much he'd overlooked, how much he'd allowed to fester beneath the surface of their supposedly perfect family. The weight of his silence, his inaction, pressed down on him, heavier than any accusation. The crystal chandeliers, once magnificent, now seemed to mock him with their cold, glittering indifference. The fight, it seemed, was only just beginning. A hush, thick and suffocating, descended upon the opulent ballroom. The scent of lilies, once intoxicating, now hung heavy with the unspoken accusations. The clinking of champagne flutes, a mere moment ago a symphony of celebration, had ceased, replaced by the frantic beat of 100 hearts. Vivien, her carefully constructed facade crumbling, stared at the document clutched in Chloe's hand, the medical report, stark and undeniable. Its contents, whispered among the guests, were a seismic shift in the carefully arranged narrative. This is a forgery." Vivien's voice, usually a silken purr, was now a harsh rasp, betraying her distress. Her eyes, usually sparkling with calculated charm, were now wide with fear, the carefully applied makeup unable to mask the tremor in her hand. Richard, his face etched with a profound weariness, stepped forward. His gaze, usually filled with shrewd observation, was now burdened with sorrow. "Vivien," he said, his voice low but firm, the words carrying more weight than any accusation. "I think we need to talk." The unspoken words, years of suppressed resentments, of compromises made in the name of appearances, hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Serafina, watching from Liam's side, felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost painful. The weight of the fabricated scandal, the public humiliation that had been so meticulously planned, was lifted. Yet, the lightness was tinged with a strange, unexpected pity. The woman she had despised for so long, the architect of her father's ruin, was now exposed, not as a malicious villain, but as a fragile, terrified individual. Liam, his hands still clasped in Serafina's, felt the shift in her emotions. He looked at Vivien, his eyes filled not with anger, but with a profound sadness. The meticulously crafted image of the perfect family, the life he had envisioned, was fractured, shattered into 1,000 pieces. His carefully structured world, founded on assumptions and blind faith, was collapsing around him. He saw the fear in Vivien's eyes, a fear as deep and profound as Serafina's own resentment had been. Chloe, her gaze unwavering, met Vivien's panicked stare. "It's not a forgery, Vivien," she stated calmly, her voice ringing with quiet strength. "It confirms what we've long suspected. Your illness, your actions." The words, though soft, carried the impact of a hammer blow, shattering the remaining vestiges of Vivien's self-control. The carefully constructed mask finally slipped, revealing the raw, frightened woman beneath. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft sobs that escaped Vivien's lips. The glittering ballroom, once a scene of extravagant joy, was now a stage for a far more complex and heartbreaking drama. The champagne, untouched, seemed to mock the bitter truth that had been revealed. The celebration was over. The unveiling had begun. The crystal chandeliers seemed to dim, their brilliance dulled by the heavy silence. Chloe, her face pale but resolute, held the medical report aloft, the stark white paper a stark contrast to the opulent gold of the ballroom. Vivien's carefully constructed composure finally fractured. A low sob escaped her lips, a sound swallowed by the stunned silence. The champagne flutes, moments ago brimming with celebratory bubbles, now stood abandoned, their contents untouched, mirroring the frozen emotions of the guests. Richard watched his wife crumble, a mixture of sorrow and long-suppressed anger swirling within him. He'd known for years of Vivien's increasingly erratic behavior, the subtle manipulations, the calculated cruelty. He'd chosen to ignore it, to bury it beneath the veneer of their seemingly perfect life. Now the truth, brutal and undeniable, was laid bare. It's not true," Vivien whispered, her voice barely audible above the hushed murmurs. Her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, were now clouded with a desperate, childlike fear. She looked at Richard, a silent plea etched on her face, a desperate attempt to find solace in the man she had spent decades deceiving. Serafina, watching from Liam's side, felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, yes, but also a profound sense of pity. The woman she had so vehemently despised was now broken, exposed, vulnerable. The anger, so potent just moments before, began to ebb, replaced by a dawning understanding. Liam, his hands still firmly clasped in Serafina's, watched the unfolding drama with a dawning horror. The meticulously crafted image of his future family, the life he'd envisioned, shattered before his eyes. He glanced at Serafina, her expression a complex blend of shock and empathy. He suddenly understood the depth of her resentment, the silent battles she had fought. The meticulously constructed facade of happiness had crumbled, revealing the raw, painful truth. He felt a pang of guilt for his own obliviousness, his own failure to recognize the unspoken pain. Chloe, her eyes unwavering, met Vivien's gaze. "It's the truth, Vivien," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It explains so much. Your actions, your cruelty, everything." The unspoken words hung in the air, years of carefully concealed illness, of desperation disguised as malice. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of joy and celebration, had become a stage for a far more profound and tragic drama. The glittering chandeliers seemed to weep, their light reflecting the tears that finally streamed down Vivien's face. The unveiling had begun, but it was not just Vivien's secrets that were revealed. It was the truth about the fragility of human nature and the power of compassion in the face of unimaginable pain. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the clinking of abandoned champagne flutes. Crystal chandeliers cast long, distorted shadows, transforming the opulent ballroom into a stage for a drama far more profound than anyone had anticipated. Chloe's defiant posture, the medical report clutched tight in her hand, was a stark counterpoint to Vivien's crumbling composure. Tears streamed down Vivien's face, not the theatrical tears of a wronged woman, but the raw, exhausted sobs of someone finally broken. It's a lie," Vivien whispered, her voice trembling, a stark contrast to her usual commanding tone. Her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, were now filled with a desperate, childlike fear. She looked at Richard, a silent plea in her gaze, a desperate attempt to find solace in the man she had deceived for so long. Richard, his face etched with a mixture of sorrow and long-suppressed anger, remained silent. He'd known, hadn't he? He'd seen the subtle manipulations, the calculated cruelty, masked beneath a veneer of perfect normalcy. He'd chosen to ignore it, to bury the truth beneath the weight of his own comfort. Now the truth lay exposed, brutal and undeniable. His gaze shifted to Serafina, whose relief was palpable, yet tinged with a surprising compassion. "It's the truth, Vivien," Chloe said, her voice quiet but firm, yet laced with a quiet sorrow. "It explains so much." Her gaze softened slightly, a flicker of empathy breaking through her anger. The years of erratic behavior, the cruelty, everything makes sense now. Serafina felt a wave of emotions wash over her. Relief, yes, but also a profound sense of pity, a dawning understanding of the pain that had fueled Vivien's actions. The anger, once a consuming fire, began to fade, replaced by a complex mixture of emotions far too nuanced for immediate understanding. Liam, his hand clasped tightly in Serafina's, watched the unfolding drama with a dawning horror. The picture of his family, his future, shattered before his very eyes. He looked at Serafina, her face a study in complexities. Shock, empathy, and a hint of something else, something that resembled forgiveness. He felt a pang of guilt for his own blindness, his own failure to see beyond the surface. The carefully crafted facade of happiness had collapsed, revealing a raw, painful truth beneath. The weight of his ignorance settled upon him, heavy and unsettling. The hushed whispers rippled through the ballroom like a disturbed pond. Crystal glasses, moments before filled with celebratory champagne, now sat abandoned, reflecting the fractured light of the chandeliers. Vivien, her meticulously crafted composure shattered, stared at the medical report, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. The crisp white paper, stark against the opulent gold tablecloth, held the undeniable truth, a truth that had the power to rewrite the narrative of their lives. "It's impossible," she breathed, her voice a fragile tremor. Tears streamed down her face, silently tracing paths through her carefully applied makeup. The carefully constructed mask of elegance crumbled, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. Richard, his gaze unwavering, watched her collapse. A lifetime of unspoken resentments, of compromises made and truths buried, weighed heavily on his shoulders. His silence, more damning than any accusation, hung heavy in the air. He saw the desperation in Vivien's eyes, the silent plea for understanding, yet felt the cold weight of his own complicity. He'd known, or at least suspected, the truth behind her manipulations, choosing to remain silent, blinded by his own desires for stability. Serafina, her initial relief now tempered with a complex tapestry of emotions, watched Vivien's disintegration. The anger that had fueled her for years flickered, replaced by a painful understanding. She saw the fragility beneath the years of carefully cultivated control, the fear that had driven Vivien's actions. Liam, sensing the profound shift in the room's dynamics, reached for her hand, his touch a silent affirmation of support amidst the chaos. His face, once filled with confusion and hurt, now reflected a deepening empathy, as the veil of ignorance was lifted. Chloe, her hand still gripping the medical report, met Serafina's gaze. A small, almost imperceptible nod passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of a shared truth, a bond forged in the crucible of shared experience. The weight of Vivien's secret, finally revealed, hung in the air, heavy and profound, changing everything. The lavish wedding, once a symbol of happiness and union, had become a crucible, forging new truths and laying bare the hidden wounds of a family grappling with a truth far more significant than any carefully orchestrated humiliation. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint clinking of abandoned silverware. Crystal chandeliers cast long, distorted shadows across the faces of the guests, their expressions a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now hung heavy with the weight of unspoken accusations. Vivien's carefully constructed facade had crumbled, revealing not just illness, but a lifetime of carefully concealed vulnerabilities. Richard, his jaw tight, watched his wife disintegrate. The years of unspoken resentments, the compromises he'd made in the name of appearances, now felt like a crushing weight on his chest. He saw the fear in Vivien's eyes, the desperate plea for understanding, and a flicker of guilt stabbed at him. He'd known, or at least suspected, the extent of her manipulations. He hadn't stopped her, not fully. "Vivien," he began, his voice low and strained, the words catching in his throat. "We need to talk." Vivien, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, managed a weak, broken sob. I didn't mean to hurt her," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hushed murmurs of the guests. It was the illness. It made me." Her voice trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, the unspoken implications hanging heavy in the air. Serafina, her initial relief tinged with a profound sadness, watched the unraveling of her stepmother. The anger that had consumed her for years ebbed, replaced by a complex mix of pity and a dawning understanding. The woman who had orchestrated her father's ruin, the woman who had tried to humiliate her on her wedding day, was also a woman broken by illness and fear. Liam, his hand still clasped tightly in hers, squeezed gently, offering silent comfort. Chloe, ever vigilant, stood beside them, her eyes darting between Vivien and Richard, her expression a mixture of concern and quiet resolve. The champagne flutes, once symbols of celebration, now seemed to mock the shattered illusion of happiness. The truth, brutally exposed, was far more complicated than they had ever imagined, far more heartbreaking. The hushed whispers escalated to a low hum, a collective intake of breath as the doctor's crisp, official-looking envelope was passed from hand to hand. The scent of lilies battled with the metallic tang of fear in the air. Liam's hand, initially comforting, now felt clammy in Serafina's. His eyes, usually sparkling with affection, were wide with disbelief. The carefully laid table, laden with gold-rimmed plates and crystal goblets, seemed to mock the sudden fragility of their happiness. It can't be," Vivien stammered, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking. Her voice, usually so controlled, trembled, betraying the terror behind her flawless makeup. The rouge on her cheeks seemed to intensify, highlighting the stark contrast with the paleness spreading around her eyes. The doctor's words, read aloud in a hushed, almost reverent tone, hung heavy. "The tests unequivocally confirm the absence of any wrongdoing on the part of Miss Serafina Moreau. However," he paused, his gaze shifting to Vivien, a flicker of professional sympathy in his eyes. "Further tests reveal a previously undiagnosed condition requiring immediate medical attention." The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Serafina felt a wave of dizzying relief wash over her, pushing back the tide of anger and hurt. But it was quickly replaced by something else, a strange mixture of pity and understanding. She saw the fear etched on Vivien's face, the brittle facade finally shattering, revealing a vulnerability she hadn't known existed. Richard, his face pale and drawn, moved to Vivien's side. He placed a hand on her arm, his touch hesitant, filled with a complex mixture of concern and long-suppressed resentment. His silence spoke volumes. Years of unspoken accusations and compromises hung heavy between them. A silent battle played out in the shadowed corners of the opulent room. Chloe, her eyes blazing with righteous anger, met Vivien's gaze with a steely resolve. "You almost ruined her life," Chloe hissed, her voice low but powerful, cutting through the stunned silence. "And for what? To satisfy your own twisted sense of control." The champagne flutes, symbols of a celebration now irrevocably tainted, lay abandoned, their contents untouched, a testament to the sudden, dramatic shift in the atmosphere. The glittering ballroom, once a stage for carefully orchestrated joy, had transformed into a battleground of truth and revelation. The gilded cage had sprung open, releasing a torrent of unspoken emotions, exposing the raw, vulnerable truth hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed appearances. The silence following the doctor's words was deafening, broken only by the clinking of abandoned champagne flutes. Crystal chandeliers cast long, distorted shadows across the room, highlighting the stark paleness of Vivien's face. The carefully applied rouge now seemed a grotesque mask, accentuating the tremor in her hands as she clutched her wine glass, knuckles bone white. The scent of lilies, once a symbol of joyous celebration, now felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Liam stared at Serafina, his eyes brimming with a confusion that mirrored his own hurt. His hand, still clasped in hers, trembled slightly. "Serafina," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. What is this?" Serafina's own relief was fragile, a delicate butterfly fluttering against the cage of her lingering anger. The weight of years of resentment, of carefully suppressed hurt, still pressed down on her. Yet, seeing Vivien's crumbling facade, a strange empathy bloomed. The woman who had orchestrated so much pain now looked utterly broken, exposed. Chloe, ever the loyal friend, stepped forward, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the stunned silence. "This changes everything," she stated, her eyes fixed on Vivien. "This proves Serafina's innocence, and it reveals your lies, Vivien. Your desperate attempts to control Serafina's life, to punish her for your own failures." Vivien flinched, her gaze darting from Chloe's accusatory stare to Richard's shocked expression. Richard, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, remained silent, his hand resting lightly on Vivien's arm, a gesture both comforting and indicative of years of unspoken resentment. The subtle shift in his posture, a slight stiffening of his shoulders, spoke volumes about his internal struggle. His silence was a dam about to burst. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of dazzling wealth and power, felt claustrophobic, the gilded cage suddenly constricting. The air crackled with unspoken words, with years of pent-up emotions finally finding their release. The weight of the revelation pressed down on everyone, a shared burden of truth and unexpected vulnerability. The lavish wedding, a meticulously planned spectacle, was irrevocably altered, its gilded facade shattered, revealing the raw and messy reality beneath. The champagne, once a symbol of celebration, now tasted like ash in their mouths. The truth, like a bitter but necessary medicine, had been served, its effects potent and far-reaching. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating as the scent of lilies. Crystal chandeliers, once celebratory beacons, now seemed to mock the stunned guests with their cold, glittering light. Vivien's carefully constructed composure crumbled. The rouge on her cheeks only highlighted the tremor in her hand as she clutched her glass. Liam's gaze darted between Serafina and Vivien, his confusion morphing into a dawning horror. He saw the relief warring with years of pent-up anger in Serafina's eyes, a fragile butterfly trapped in a gilded cage. "Liam," Serafina began, her voice barely a whisper, yet cutting through the stunned silence. She looked at her fiancé, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, a mixture of relief and a lingering hurt visible in her trembling lips. The words caught in her throat, choked by the weight of unspoken truths. Richard, his face a study in conflicted emotions, finally broke the silence. His voice was low, a rumble that vibrated through the hushed room. "Vivien," he said, his gaze unwavering, This changes everything." The gentleness in his voice was a stark contrast to the steel in his eyes, a chilling testament to the years of unspoken resentment finally breaking free. Vivien's breath hitched, her carefully constructed mask shattered, revealing a vulnerability that was both shocking and heartbreaking. The carefully crafted persona of the elegant stepmother was gone, replaced by a woman broken and exposed, her shoulders slumping as if bearing the weight of the world. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of her power, now felt like a prison, its gilded walls closing in on her. Her whispered confession, a broken apology that was drowned out by the collective gasp from the horrified guests, was a testament to her complete defeat. Chloe stepped closer to Serafina, her hand finding its way to Serafina's arm, offering silent strength and support. The warmth of Chloe's presence against Serafina's skin offered a moment of stability in the chaos, a silent affirmation of their bond. The look they shared was filled with unspoken understanding, a private conversation amid the public turmoil. Their shared gaze, filled with both relief and the weight of the revelation, cemented their unwavering friendship. The silence held, pregnant with the weight of unspoken words, years of suppressed emotions finally finding their release. The champagne, once a symbol of celebration, now tasted like ash in their mouths, the bitter taste of truth. The hushed whispers rippled through the ballroom like disturbed water. Crystal glasses, half filled with forgotten champagne, reflected the flickering candlelight, creating a shimmering, unsettling tableau. Vivien, her carefully applied makeup now a mask of barely contained panic, stared down at her trembling hands. The opulent setting, once a symbol of her triumph, now felt like a suffocating cage. Liam, his face pale, looked from Serafina to Vivien, his eyes wide with disbelief. He'd loved Serafina fiercely, blindly, but this shattered his carefully constructed image of his future. What does this mean?" he stammered, his voice barely audible above the rustling silk and the soft gasps of the guests. Serafina, however, felt a strange calm settle over her. The relief, while immense, wasn't unadulterated. Years of simmering resentment, fueled by Vivien's calculated cruelty, still burned beneath the surface. She met Liam's gaze, her own eyes filled with a complex mixture of hurt, anger, and a nascent understanding. "It means," she began, her voice stronger than she anticipated, "that everything she's ever said about me is a lie." Chloe, her eyes blazing with righteous fury, stepped forward. "And everything she's ever done," she added, her voice sharp, "has been a calculated act of cruelty." She glared at Vivien, her loyalty to Serafina unwavering. The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension vibrating between the two women. Richard, his face grim, watched the unfolding drama with a mixture of horror and a strange, almost grim satisfaction. Years of silent resentment toward his wife, years of witnessing her manipulations, had finally culminated in this moment of truth. He saw the fragility behind Vivien's carefully constructed facade. The woman she was vulnerable, terrified, and deeply unwell. The weight of this revelation settled heavily on his shoulders. He shifted his weight, the silence seeming to stretch endlessly. The medical report, stark and undeniable, lay on a nearby table, a cold, hard testament to the truth. The champagne, the music, the dazzling lights, all faded into a background hum against the deafening silence of revelation. The opulent ballroom had become a crucible, where truth and lies were being forged in the fires of betrayal and the unexpected heat of compassion. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the erratic ticking of a grandfather clock in the far corner of the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers glittered, casting fractured light on the faces of the stunned guests. The scent of lilies, once fresh and celebratory, now hung heavy with the weight of unspoken accusations. Vivien's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. A tremor ran through her, visible even through the layers of silk and jewels. Liam's gaze, still fixed on Serafina, held a mixture of hurt and dawning comprehension. "Serafina," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "What is happening?" Serafina, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, met his gaze. The years of carefully concealed resentment warred with a sudden, unexpected surge of relief. "It's complicated," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about more than just a lie, Liam. It's about a life of lies." Chloe, ever loyal, stepped closer, her hand resting protectively on Serafina's arm. "Vivien's been playing games, Liam, manipulating everyone, including you." Her voice was sharp, fueled by righteous anger. "This report, it proves everything we've suspected." Richard, observing the scene with a grim expression, felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Years of silent resentment towards Vivien, swallowed down for the sake of appearances, now surfaced in a bitter tide. He saw the fear in his wife's eyes, a fear that went beyond the implications of the medical report. It was the fear of exposure, of a lifetime of deceit finally being laid bare. He cleared his throat, the sound breaking the suffocating silence. "There's more to this than meets the eye," he stated, his voice resonating with a quiet authority. The revelation of Vivien's illness, a severe, progressive condition, was not just a twist of fate. It was a key that unlocked years of her manipulative behavior. The weight of that understanding settled heavily on him. The scene shifted, the opulent ballroom suddenly feeling smaller, more intimate, the focus tightening around the core players in this unfolding drama. The champagne flutes, the gleaming silverware, the extravagant decor, all became mere background noise in the face of raw, human emotion. The carefully constructed facade of perfection had crumbled, revealing the messy, complex truth beneath. The silence hung heavy, a tangible thing pressing down on the opulent ballroom. Crystal shards seemed to glitter with malicious glee, reflecting the fractured light onto Vivien's face. Her meticulously crafted smile had crumbled, replaced by a stark, almost childlike fear. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now felt cloying, suffocating. Liam's hand, trembling slightly, reached for Serafina's. His eyes, usually bright with affection, were clouded with confusion and hurt. "Serafina," he whispered again, his voice raw with emotion. "Explain." Serafina, her own tears finally spilling, leaned into Liam's touch, finding solace in his presence despite the chaos swirling around them. "It's not what it seems," she choked out, her voice thick with unshed tears. The carefully constructed walls around her heart, built brick by brick over years of silent resentment, were beginning to crumble. Chloe, her eyes blazing with righteous fury, stepped forward. "It's a lie, Liam, a calculated, cruel lie orchestrated by Vivien." She pointed a shaking finger at Vivien, her voice ringing with accusation. "She's been manipulating everyone, twisting things to her advantage." Richard watched, his face a mask of grim determination. The years of silent resentment he'd harbored towards his wife, buried beneath a veneer of polite civility, now threatened to erupt. He saw the tremor in Vivien's hands, the subtle twitch in her jaw, betraying the carefully controlled facade. It wasn't just the medical report. It was the culmination of years of deceit. He felt a strange mixture of pity and anger welling up inside him. The medical report, stark and undeniable, lay on a nearby table, a single sheet of paper that had rewritten the script of their lives. It exposed not just Vivien's treachery, but a devastating truth about her own failing health, a secret she had guarded fiercely, fueling her desperation and manipulative acts. The revelation hung in the air, thick and heavy, a silent accusation against Vivien's carefully constructed lies. The whispers started again, this time laced with shock and disbelief, a tide turning against Vivien. Her carefully constructed world, built on deception and manipulation, was falling apart brick by brick. The weight of her secret, and the consequences of her actions, pressed down on her, visible in the sudden slump of her shoulders, the desperate way her eyes darted around the room. Serafina, initially overwhelmed by relief, felt a complex mix of emotions surge through her. Anger, yes, but also pity, a dawning understanding of the desperation that had driven Vivien to such extremes. The woman who had orchestrated her father's ruin, the woman she had loathed for so long, was revealed to be both victim and perpetrator. The revelation was not just an exoneration. It was a beginning, the beginning of understanding, of forgiveness, and perhaps even of healing. The champagne flutes, abandoned halfway, reflected the shattered image of a family, a reflection of the complicated truth that had been laid bare. The opulent ballroom, moments ago vibrant with laughter and music, now hummed with a stunned silence. Crystal chandeliers glittered, their light reflecting off the untouched champagne flutes, mocking the halted celebration. Liam, his face pale, stared at Serafina, his hand still gently clasped in hers. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. I don't understand," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The carefully constructed facade of his perfect wedding day had crumbled, revealing a harsh, unsettling reality. Serafina, her own relief tinged with a bitter aftertaste, met his gaze. Tears streamed down her face, a mixture of relief and a raw, aching sorrow. "It's a lie, Liam," she managed, her voice trembling. "Everything Vivien said. It was all a lie." The words felt inadequate, insufficient to explain the years of carefully constructed resentment, the pain that had driven her to the brink. Chloe, her fierce loyalty a blazing fire, moved to Serafina's side, her hand resting protectively on her arm. "He needs to hear the truth, Serafina, the whole truth." Her voice, though filled with anger, held a reassuring firmness. The scent of lilies, previously sweet and celebratory, now felt cloying, thick with the unspoken emotions hanging heavy in the air. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint clinking of discarded silverware. Richard, observing from a distance, felt a strange mix of relief for Serafina and a deep, unsettling unease. He had always sensed Vivien's manipulative nature, but to see it laid bare, so brutally exposed, was a shock. The years of silent resentment, the compromises made for the sake of appearances, now felt like a crushing weight. His gaze fell upon his wife, her face a mask of barely controlled fear, her usually flawless composure shattered. The medical report, a stark, unforgiving truth, had rewritten their lives. The opulent setting, the lavish celebration, all seemed grotesque in the wake of this devastating revelation. The truth, raw and unforgiving, had shattered the gilded cage. The silence in the ballroom was a suffocating blanket. Crystal chandeliers, once sparkling with celebratory light, now seemed to mock the stunned guests with their cold, glittering indifference. Liam, his face ashen, reached for Serafina's hand, his touch tentative, questioning. The champagne flutes, untouched, stood in stark rows, mirroring the rigid formality that had replaced the joyous abandon of moments before. I don't know what to believe," Liam whispered, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his own heart. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, crushing the carefully constructed fantasy of his perfect wedding day. He looked at Serafina, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, a mixture of relief and a deep, lingering sorrow. Serafina squeezed his hand, the gesture a silent reassurance. "It's a lie, Liam," she said, her voice trembling. The words tasted like ash in her mouth, inadequate to express the years of simmering resentment, the pain that had driven her to the brink. The opulent ballroom, the lavish decorations, all felt grotesquely out of place, a stark contrast to the raw, emotional truth that had been unveiled. Chloe, her face a mask of furious protectiveness, stepped closer. "He deserves the truth, Serafina," she insisted, her voice low but firm. "Vivien's lies can't be allowed to stand." Her gaze, sharp and unwavering, locked with Vivien's, who stood frozen, her carefully constructed composure crumbling before their very eyes. The lilies, their fragrance once celebratory, now hung heavy in the air, a cloying sweetness that seemed to mirror the bitterness of the truth. Richard watched from the periphery, his heart heavy with a complex mixture of relief for Serafina and a profound sense of unease. The years of unspoken resentments, the compromises made for the sake of appearances, now felt like a crushing weight on his chest. He looked at his wife, her face pale and drawn, her usual flawless facade shattered, replaced by a raw, vulnerable fear that chilled him to the bone. The medical report, a stark and unforgiving truth, had irrevocably rewritten their lives. The lavish celebration, once a source of pride, now felt like a grotesque parody of their fractured family. The silence, thick with unspoken accusations and simmering emotions, stretched, an agonizing testament to the shattered illusion of perfection. The heavy silence hung, thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken accusations. Crystal shards, scattered from a carelessly knocked-over champagne tower, mirrored the fractured state of the family. Liam's hand, still clasped in Serafina's, felt cold and clammy. His gaze, usually bright with adoration, was clouded with confusion and a nascent fear. This changes everything," he finally whispered, his voice raspy. Serafina squeezed his hand, a silent promise against the storm raging within her. Relief warred with a bitter taste of vindication. Years of suppressed rage, fueled by Vivien's calculated cruelty, threatened to overwhelm her newfound freedom. She looked at Liam, at the raw vulnerability etched on his handsome face, and a wave of guilt washed over her. "I wish it didn't," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. Chloe, ever the loyal sentinel, stepped forward, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. "It shouldn't have come to this," she stated, her voice sharp, cutting through the stunned silence. "Vivien's lies have poisoned everything." Her gaze, fierce and unwavering, locked with Vivien's. The older woman, usually so impeccably composed, stood rigid, her face pale and drawn, the carefully constructed mask of elegance crumbling around her. Richard, observing from the sidelines, felt a profound weariness settling over him. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of his success, felt like a gilded cage. The years of carefully constructed peace, the compromises made to maintain appearances, were all shattered. He watched his wife, her vulnerability a stark contrast to her usual calculated charm, and a wave of pity mingled with long-suppressed resentment washed over him. The medical report, a cruel twist of fate, had laid bare the truth, exposing the deep fissures within their seemingly perfect family. The silence stretched, laden with the weight of unspoken truths and the bitter aftertaste of betrayal. The champagne, once a symbol of celebration, now seemed a mocking reminder of the shattered dreams. The air thrummed with unspoken questions, the future shrouded in uncertainty. The wedding, once a fairy tale, had become a battleground, a stark and unsettling revelation of family secrets and hidden resentments. The crystal chandelier cast long, shimmering shadows across the room, highlighting the stunned silence. The scent of lilies, once intoxicatingly sweet, now felt cloying, heavy with the weight of unspoken accusations. Liam, his face pale under the harsh glare of the lights, stared at Serafina, his eyes wide with disbelief. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, unsure. "Serafina," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I don't understand." Serafina's own emotions were a tempest. Relief warred with a bitter resentment, the years of simmering anger threatening to erupt. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a complex mix of pain and defiance. "Neither do I," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But at least it's the truth." The words hung in the air, fragile as spun glass. Chloe, her eyes flashing with anger, moved closer, her hand resting protectively on Serafina's arm. "It's not enough," she hissed, her voice low, directed at Vivien. "This doesn't erase what you've done." Vivien, her carefully constructed composure shattered, stood as still as a statue. The vibrant crimson of her dress seemed to mock the pallor of her face. Her eyes, usually glittering with calculated charm, were now dull, haunted by a weariness that reached far beyond the immediate scandal. She looked from Serafina to Liam, her lips trembling slightly. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, a stark contrast to the flawless image she always maintained. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft clinking of champagne glasses abandoned halfway to lips. The opulent ballroom, once a haven of joyous celebration, now felt like a suffocating tomb. The air thrummed with a collective gasp held captive in the chests of the assembled guests. The weight of revelation pressed down, heavy and suffocating, a stark contrast to the lightness of the earlier merriment. Richard, observing the unfolding drama with a heavy heart, felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. The years of carefully constructed illusions, the compromises made to maintain a semblance of harmony, all lay shattered around them, glittering shards reflecting a fractured reality. He stepped forward, his presence a silent attempt to restore some order, some semblance of control to the descending chaos. The future, once a clear horizon, was now shrouded in the uncertainty of a stormy twilight. The gilded cage, once a symbol of success and happiness, now felt like a prison. The true cost of their carefully crafted facade was finally laid bare. The crystal chandeliers, once sparkling with celebratory joy, now seemed to cast a cold, accusing light on the scene. Liam, his face etched with confusion and hurt, stared at Serafina, his hand still hesitantly resting on hers. The champagne flutes, abandoned mid-toast, reflected the fractured light, mirroring the shattered illusion of their perfect wedding day. "Serafina," Liam whispered, his voice thick with emotion. What is all this?" Serafina's eyes, usually bright with laughter, were clouded with a storm of conflicting emotions. Relief warred with a bitter resentment, years of suppressed anger threatening to consume her. The scent of lilies, once so intoxicating, now felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. "It's a long story, Liam," she breathed, her voice trembling. "A story of lies and manipulations." She glanced at Vivien, whose carefully constructed composure had finally crumbled, leaving behind a shell of exhaustion and despair. The vibrant red of her dress clashed harshly with the ashen pallor of her face. A sob escaped Vivien's lips, a sound both fragile and desperate. It was a sound that stripped away years of carefully cultivated elegance, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. For the first time, Serafina saw a flicker of something akin to remorse in Vivien's haunted eyes. It was a brief glimpse, quickly obscured by the shadow of her illness, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt, a crack in the wall of resentment Serafina had built around her heart. Chloe, her face a mask of controlled fury, stepped closer. "It's not enough," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous, directed at Vivien. "This doesn't erase years of manipulation and cruelty." Her hand tightened protectively on Serafina's arm, a silent promise of unwavering support. Richard watched the unfolding drama with a heavy heart, his face a mixture of grief and weary acceptance. The years of carefully constructed illusions, the compromises made to preserve appearances, lay in ruins around them. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of success and happiness, now felt like a suffocating tomb, the air thick with the unspoken words hanging between them. He knew that the path ahead would be long and arduous, but in the shattered pieces of their carefully constructed world, he saw a glimmer of something new, the potential for a more genuine and honest future. However painful the process might be, the truth had been revealed, but the journey towards healing had only just begun. The silence in the ballroom was deafening, broken only by the faint clinking of abandoned silverware. Crystal chandeliers, once sparkling with festive light, now seemed to cast a harsh, unforgiving glow on the exposed raw emotions. Liam, his face pale, stared at Serafina, a mixture of hurt and disbelief etched onto his features. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it brushed against hers. The touch was tentative, questioning. "Serafina," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Tell me what's happening." Serafina's eyes, usually sparkling with life, were now filled with a storm of conflicting emotions. Relief mingled with a deep-seated anger, years of suppressed resentment threatening to erupt. The scent of lilies, once so intoxicating, now felt cloying, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat constricting her words. "It's a long story, Liam," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "A story of lies and carefully constructed illusions." Her gaze shifted to Vivien, whose carefully maintained composure had shattered, revealing a woman ravaged by exhaustion and despair. The vibrant red of her dress clashed jarringly with the ashen pallor of her face. A single tear escaped Vivien's eye, tracing a path down her cheek, a stark contrast to her usually impeccable makeup. It was a tear that spoke volumes, a tear of regret, of exhaustion, of a life lived in the shadows of carefully constructed lies. For the first time, Serafina saw a flicker of remorse in Vivien's eyes, a fleeting moment of vulnerability before the mask of self-preservation was hastily reapplied. Chloe, her face a mask of controlled fury, stepped forward, her protective arm encircling Serafina's shoulders. "It's not enough," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "This doesn't erase years of cruelty and manipulation." Her eyes, blazing with righteous anger, locked onto Vivien's. Richard observed the unfolding drama with a heavy heart, his gaze shifting between his wife and his soon-to-be daughter-in-law. The weight of years of unspoken resentments, of compromises made to maintain a facade of perfection, pressed down on him. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of success and happiness, now felt like a gilded cage, the air thick with unspoken words. He knew the road ahead would be long and arduous, but amidst the shattered pieces of their carefully constructed lives, he saw a glimmer of hope, the potential for a more genuine and honest future. However painful the journey might be, the truth had been revealed, but the path to healing had only just begun. The silence hung heavy, thick with the unspoken accusations and shattered expectations. Crystal shards, scattered like fallen stars from a broken chandelier, reflected the fractured light of the ballroom. Liam's hand, still resting lightly on Serafina's, trembled. His gaze, usually bright with affection, was clouded with confusion and a nascent fear. The scent of lilies, once so celebratory, now felt cloying, heavy with the weight of deceit. "Tell me," Liam whispered again, his voice husky with unshed tears. "Tell me everything." Serafina looked at him, her eyes mirroring the storm raging within. Relief warred with a bitter anger, years of resentment finally breaking through the surface. She opened her mouth, then closed it, the words catching in her throat. The weight of it all, the lies, the manipulations, the years of carefully constructed pain, felt almost unbearable. Chloe, her face a mask of fierce protectiveness, squeezed Serafina's shoulder. "Don't," she said, her voice low and sharp. "Not yet. Let them stew in their own mess for a while." Her gaze, cold and unwavering, was locked onto Vivien, whose carefully composed facade had finally crumbled, revealing a woman ravaged by illness and regret. Vivien's breath hitched, a ragged sound lost in the stunned silence. A single tear, slow and deliberate, traced a path down her cheek, staining the vibrant red of her dress. It was a tear not of defiance, but of profound exhaustion, a silent confession of a life lived in the shadows of her own making. Richard watched, his face etched with a profound sadness. He saw the woman he had loved, the woman who had built a life with him, reduced to this, a fragile shell of her former self. The weight of their shared history, the unspoken resentments and compromises, felt heavier than ever before. The glittering ballroom, once a symbol of their success, now felt like a gilded prison, their carefully constructed lives lying in ruins around them. A low murmur rippled through the stunned. A lavish wedding becomes the stage for an attempted humiliation that backfires spectacularly when medical results arrive. Within the gilded reception hall, champagne toasts turn to shocked whispers as test results circulate. Between vengeance and vindication lies a truth that will leave everyone questioning their assumptions. As celebration turns to revelation, the true meaning of family emerges. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The grand ballroom of the Blackwood Manor shimmered. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, honeyed light on the scene, illuminating the swirling silks and shimmering jewels of the wedding guests. Serafina, breathtaking in her ivory gown, felt the weight of the fabric, a stark contrast to the lightness she desperately tried to project. A forced smile played on her lips as she greeted guests, each carefully chosen word a shield against the turmoil within. Liam, her handsome groom, oblivious to her inner struggle, beamed beside her, his hand resting possessively on her lower back. The champagne flowed, a river of bubbly obliviousness washing over the carefully constructed facade of happiness. A faint tremor of anxiety ran through her as she caught Vivien's eye across the room. Her stepmother, a vision in emerald green, held a predatory grace, her smile a thin, dangerous line. The scent of lilies, Vivien's signature perfume, hung heavy in the air, a cloying sweetness that mirrored the woman herself. Serafina's stomach clenched. Tonight, the carefully laid plans of revenge brewed in Vivien's heart were about to come to fruition. "You look radiant, darling," Vivien purred, her voice laced with a honeyed venom that Serafina recognized instantly. She leaned in, her breath hot on Serafina's ear. But even the most beautiful flower can wilt under the harsh light of truth. The words were a poisoned dart, aimed directly at Serafina's carefully constructed composure. A knot tightened in Serafina's chest. The years of simmering resentment, the calculated humiliations, all culminated in this moment. Revenge pulsed through her veins, a hot, dangerous current threatening to overwhelm her. Yet, a tiny spark of hope flickered. Would Liam see through the charade? Would the truth prevail? The weight of those questions pressed down on her, as heavy as the tiara perched upon her head. The elegant ballroom, once a symbol of joy, now felt like a gilded cage, and she, its captive bird, was about to be exposed. The music swelled, a crescendo of violins and cellos that did little to soothe Serafina's churning stomach. The champagne flute felt cold and heavy in her hand, the bubbles a mocking echo of her inner turmoil. Liam, oblivious to her distress, leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against her skin. His words, meant to be comforting, felt like a cruel irony. "Thank you," she managed, her voice a mere breath. The smile she offered felt brittle, a fragile mask threatening to shatter. She glanced towards Vivien, who was engaged in animated conversation with a group of elegantly dressed women. Her laughter a brittle, high-pitched sound that grated on Serafina's nerves. The scent of lilies, cloying and suffocating, seemed to intensify, a constant reminder of the impending doom. Chloe, ever vigilant, squeezed Serafina's hand beneath the table. The silent gesture was a lifeline, a small comfort in the overwhelming tide of anxiety. Serafina returned the squeeze, her eyes meeting Chloe's across the table, finding a silent understanding in their shared apprehension. Richard, Liam's father, observed the scene from across the room, his expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality that concealed a keen awareness of the tension simmering beneath the surface of the celebration. His eyes flickered between Serafina and Vivien, a flicker of concern in their depths. Vivien's gaze locked onto Serafina's for a brief, charged moment. A subtle, almost imperceptible nod passed between her and the woman she'd been speaking with earlier. A lawyer, Serafina recalled, with a sharp, predatory gaze that mirrored her stepmother's own. The unspoken message sent a chill down Serafina's spine, solidifying the dread that had been gnawing at her all evening. The carefully constructed facade of happiness crumbled further, replaced by a grim determination. Tonight, the fight was on. Tonight, the truth would be revealed, even if she had to reveal it herself. The weight of the tiara felt crushing. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a battleground, and she was ready to fight. The clinking of champagne flutes was a discordant symphony against the throbbing in Serafina's temples. Each celebratory chime felt like a hammer blow against the fragile composure she'd painstakingly constructed. The opulent ballroom, a shimmering cage of crystal chandeliers and polished mahogany, felt suffocating. The scent of lilies, once intoxicating, now clung to her like a shroud. Liam, oblivious to her turmoil, smiled, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. "You're breathtaking," he murmured, his voice a comforting balm against the storm raging within her. But the words felt hollow, a stark contrast to the icy dread creeping into her heart. Chloe, sensing her friend's distress, leaned in, her whisper barely audible above the murmur of conversation. "He's coming," she said, her voice tight with apprehension. "The lawyer." Serafina nodded, her throat constricting. The lawyer, Vivien's pawn, was the harbinger of her stepmother's carefully planned humiliation. A manufactured scandal, designed to shatter her reputation and destroy her happiness. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. Vivien, radiating false warmth, moved through the crowd like a predator. Her smile, flawless and chillingly serene, didn't reach her eyes that held a predatory glint that Serafina knew all too well. The woman she'd been speaking to earlier, the lawyer, slipped discreetly away, her sharp features etched with an almost gleeful anticipation. Richard, Liam's father, watched them, his brow furrowed in silent contemplation. His gaze, sharp and assessing, lingered on Vivien, then shifted to Serafina. A mixture of concern and something akin to pity etched on his face. He understood the game, Serafina knew. He had always known. The air thickened with a palpable sense of foreboding. The music, once celebratory, now felt ominous, a prelude to something terrible. Serafina felt a cold hand clutch at her heart, a stark reminder of the vulnerability beneath her carefully constructed facade. The battle, she knew, was about to begin, and this time she wasn't sure she could win. The weight of the tiara, once a symbol of joy, now felt like a lead weight, threatening to drag her under. The champagne tasted like ashes in her mouth. The lawyer, a thin woman with sharp, predatory eyes, approached Serafina, a cruel smile playing on her lips. The scent of lilies, heavy in the air, suddenly felt cloying, a suffocating sweetness mirroring the nausea rising in Serafina's throat. Liam, oblivious, squeezed her hand, his touch strangely cold despite his warm smile. "Everything all right, darling?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmuring guests. Serafina managed a weak smile, a ghost of her usual radiant self. "Perfect," she lied, the word tasting like ash on her tongue. Chloe, sensing the deception, subtly shifted closer, her hand resting reassuringly on Serafina's arm. The pressure was a silent reassurance, a small comfort in the growing storm. Vivien, her stepmother, watched from across the room, a predatory gleam in her eyes. Her smile was a carefully constructed mask, hiding the simmering malice Serafina knew so well. The champagne flutes, once symbols of celebration, now seemed like weapons poised to strike. The clinking glass felt like a relentless, mocking rhythm. "I have some documents," the lawyer announced, her voice cutting through the polite chatter. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread.